Hello, this is Helen Adderley here again from Diamond Support for Parents, Carers and Advocates. In this short video, I just want to talk about where you might need to go for the basic information on how to access a care package. That depends on essentially where you live, whether it's England or Wales, those are the two I'm talking about today. Or whether, and indeed whether the individual is an adult or a child. The principal difference between England and Wales is that in England the legislation that sets out the rules in relation to care and support is the Care Act 2014. In Wales it's set out under the Social Services and Wellbeing Wales Act 2014. Now they have a lot of things in common, but the main difference is that in England you can have a personal budget for healthcare needs direct from the NHS for your the healthcare bit of your support, but that doesn't happen in Wales. In this video I'm going to talk about what happens in England, and then I will do a separate video for those of us, including myself, who live in Wales. And of course it's different again in Northern Ireland and of course in Scotland. So principally this video is about what happens in England. The Care Act 2014 has now come into operation, and although there are still some outstanding elements of that relates to the cap on care costs, which has been put off until 2020. So that's not something that we would discuss at this point, because I'm principally concerned with children and young people, although there is no reason at all why the documentation and the paperwork that you can find on the DSPCA website cannot be applied to older individuals, as I say, to people with different disabilities. The principles remain the same, but they would need to be obviously adjusted to be suitable for each individual person. So the Care Act principally addresses adults with care and support needs, and the provisions therefore, if you are the carer or supporter or indeed an individual with needs, the Care Act is where you need to go. It's not a difficult act to actually read, and often one of my bugbears, I suppose, is that you might Google a question about the care and support needs that you may have and how you access those, and often your Google search or whatever will take you to a website which offers advice on this. Now just be careful where you're getting that advice from, because in my experience it depends which angle they are coming from in relation to giving you that advice, and also be careful as to where they've got their advice from. Have they actually gone and done their own homework, and have they read through the Act itself for the specific wording? In my experience that often doesn't happen, and people who may put stuff onto a website or may give you advice have been on a training program, a training day about the Care Act, and therefore they've accepted as read all the stuff that they have been taught about the Care Act, which they will then regurgitate when asked a question. And it's a bit like Chinese whispers. The person who's prepared the training will have prepared it based on their own research, and we don't know what that research is. Then they supply it to an individual who then puts their own take on it, because they're looking at it from their particular perspective, depending on which organisation they're working for and the people that they are talking to. And then you've got the interpretation which the individual then puts on it. So by the time you get to the end of it, you may end up in a situation where you're getting the wrong end of the stick entirely, not through your own fault. But it, as I say, what's actually put in the Act and the advice that you actually get at the end of the day may be very different. It's very easy to access all government legislation. You go to the website gov.uk and or you can actually put in your search engine the name of the Act, and it will take you straight to it. If you look along the results that you get from your search, that high up on there is the actual Act, and it will take you to it. Usually at the beginning of the Act, there is a list of the contents which gives you the number of the section and what that section deals with, so that it's quite easy to find the bit that relates to you. And you just click on it and it will take you to that particular part of the Act which you can read. That often then refers you to other sections within the Act which may be relevant to you. Don't be put off by going to an Act of Parliament and seeing that it's got 96 sections, because very often whole sections of that Act are not applicable to your circumstances. So for example, if you don't have a cared for child, a child that is cared for by the local authority, then there's a whole chunk of the Act that doesn't apply to you. There's also a chunk of legislation which relates to individuals who are in custody. That may not apply to you, and that is true of lots and lots of pieces of legislation. So please don't be afraid to go and read it for yourself. If you find that you've read it and you think I need a bit of advice on interpreting that, then please send me a question. I'd be very pleased to try and answer that for you, particularly if you feel, how does that apply to me in my particular circumstances? Often it's difficult to give advice on generalities within an Act of Parliament, because they are drawn up to try and apply to every situation, and you then have to bring your particular circumstances to the table to then be able to interpret those words in relation to what they mean to you. But essentially, if the person who is looking for a support plan is an adult living in England, then they need to go and have a look at the Care Act 2014, where they'll find the different measures that apply to them. If they are a child, and there are specific ways of determining whether a person is a child, then they need to go to the Children and Families Act 2014. This is the new Act which brings into play the new EHC assessments, which replace statements of special educational need, which used to be in existence. The EHC is an assessment of the educational, health and social care needs of an individual, be that a child or a young person. And that piece of legislation has actually extended the young person section, if you like, up to 25. So it will apply, the EHC for an individual will apply up to the end of the academic year in which that individual turns 25. Now that's a big difference. It used to be school age, and statements used to end when a person was no longer basically acceptable, if you like, for an education setting. And the problem with that was, I think a lot of people found it very difficult that not only did education cease when the person was 19, so again it was the end of the academic year in which that person became 19, but also they transferred into adult social care at the same time. So education finished, social care moved into adult services, as did healthcare. And so an individual was faced with all of their care needs and the person's dealing with that, all changing at the same time, and it was extremely difficult for people with disabilities and their carers to cope with that massive change all at the same time. So the Children and Families Act 2014 has now incorporated within it not just education needs, but education, healthcare and social care needs, all under the one umbrella of an EHC assessment. The local authority has an obligation to do that assessment when a person, now that can be the individual, it can be the parent of that individual, or someone looking after them, or at school. They can apply for one of these assessments to be done. And there are lots and lots of regulations about how that has to be done. The reason why they have rolled together education, health and social services in one assessment in England is because when my son was much younger, we had the situation, and I'm sure a lot of people will identify with this, where they would argue between the departments as to whether a particular issue that a child had was an education need, a healthcare need, or a social care need. And the classic one that I always remember is toilet training, because often individuals with disabilities, particularly autism, find it difficult to become toilet trained, and particular measures need to be put in place to enable them to do that. And whilst we were, still going round the merry-go-round, education would say, oh, well, toilet training isn't an education issue, that's a health issue. And so you would go to the healthcare meeting and you would speak to the individuals there, and they say, no, it's not a healthcare issue because the child is over 3 or 4. It's a social care issue. So you would go to the meeting with the social care individuals, and they said, well, no, really, it's an education issue because it's interfering with his ability to learn. And so it would go on. They would send it round the different departments, and in the middle was the child who wasn't getting the support that they needed. And this has been a shocking situation which has had to be addressed. Now, I think there were moves to try and make sure that the different departments worked together and that situation should not happen. But unfortunately, it fell on deaf ears, and in certain areas of the country, certainly those different departments were not working in unison. They were attempting to still stand back and delay and try and make the funding come from a different area for that individual. And so we now have legislation. Now, the person or the body that takes control of that situation is the local authority. They are the person who you apply to for an education, health and social care assessment. And it's up to them to make sure that the other bodies cooperate with them. There are provisions and how they have to do that, and there is actually within the Act a provision for there to be a criminal prosecution of a body that does not cooperate with the local authority in putting this together. So it's a fine, but there are teeth attached to this provision now, finally. So the essential provisions that you need to look at, if you like, in the Children and Families Act 2014. Section 36, the assessment of education, health and care needs. Now I'll read that out to you, and hopefully it will appear at the bottom of the screen. A request for a local authority in England to secure an EHC needs assessment for a child or young person may be made to the authority by the child's parent, the young person, or a person acting on behalf of a school or post-16 institution. An EHC needs assessment is an assessment of the educational, healthcare and social care needs of a child or young person. So that's section 36. It then goes on in section 37 where it says, where in the light of an EHC needs assessment it is necessary for special educational provision to be made for a child or young person in accordance with an EHC plan, the local authority must secure that an EHC plan is prepared for the child or young person, and once an EHC plan has been prepared, it must maintain the plan. So there has to be, in the same way as there was in relation to statements, there has to be an annual review of an EHC plan, and it sets out that must be done within 12 months of the commencement of the EHC plan, and then 12 months of the anniversary of that, or 12 months of whenever the review took place. So if, for example, they can do a review earlier than 12 months if the situation changes or an additional need becomes apparent, but if the review then takes place, say, after 10 months, then the next one must take place within 12 months of that review. They can't then revert to the original date and wait for 14 months, for example. There's also provision in section 49 for personal budgets and direct payments. The emphasis within the Act is to not only ensure that the individual and the parents are involved and take part in this process, but that their actual needs of that child are assessed, but also the provision is part of the choice of the individual and their parents. So there's much more involvement. Parents have to have information provided to them, and the local authority is responsible for providing that information, because with information comes educated choice. It's very difficult to make a choice when people aren't telling you what the different options are or what they may mean for that individual. Often in the past, parents were found it necessary to go and do their own research. They shouldn't. I wouldn't ever say don't go and do your own research. I think that is a must. But it should now be based on some information that's coming to you, so you're not going out there blind and looking for anything and everything that is out there, which can be very overwhelming. If the local authority can start to set you on the right path of the kind of things that you might be looking for, then that is a great start for any family. You also have to be informed. There are time limits, there are rules and regulations, and there is a code of practice which was brought out in January 2015. This is Special Educational Needs and Disability Code of Practice, and there are other codes of practice which have also been produced. Again, you can look at that on the internet, and the things about codes of practice are that perhaps they are much easier to read than the actual legislation, because they're set out in more practical terms, and they set out what the local authority has to do. I have here in front of me part of the Code of Practice, the Special Educational Needs and Disability Code of Practice. Now it's 0 to 25 years statutory guidance for organisations which work with and support children and young people who have special educational needs or disabilities. So if you think that fits your criteria, then you need to go and have a look at this Code of Practice. It refers to the basic principles which underpin the Code of Practice. Now, the Code of Practice, remember, is drawn from the legislation. It's set out under regulations which are in the legislation. Codes of practice are not legislation, so they are not legally binding in the sense that you have to do what it says in a code of practice. However, they do have very strong supportive organisation, if you like, so that if you depart from a code of practice, then you have to explain and have available a very, very good reason to depart from a code of practice. So a code of practice will set down things that a local authority must do, and if they're going to depart from that code of practice, then they would have to have a really, really good reason for doing that. So the principles underpinning the code of practice. Section 19 of the Children and Families Act 2014 makes clear that local authorities, in carrying out their functions under the Act in relation to disabled children and young people and those with special educational needs, must have regard to the views, wishes and feelings of the child or young person and the child's parents. They must also have regard to the importance of the child or young person and the child's parents participating as fully as possible in decisions and being provided with the information and support necessary to enable participation in those decisions. They must also have regard to the need to support the child or young person and the child's parents in order to facilitate the development of the child or young person and to help them achieve the best possible educational and other outcomes, preparing them effectively for adulthood. Now, one of those principles, well, all of those principles, in fact, are important in establishing collaboration between all of the people involved in the plan for the young person, including the young person. And it's also important that those principles establish that there is choice. There is a choice. You no longer have to sit there and accept, well, the local authorities decided that this is the provision that you will have. If you think that that is not an appropriate provision for your child, or they're not happy to go there, then you can be involved in that process. And there is an appeal process if there is, a disagreement in that. Now, there's a whole raft of provisions about how you should pursue that. And again, you can go and have a look at that online. It's readily accessible, and it's not that difficult to read. Now, there was a couple of questions that came upon me that I thought people might want to know. So, for example, you are a carer of a child who has either a disability or a special educational need, or both. And can you have your needs assessed separately? The answer to that is yes, indeed you can. The Children and Families Act 2014 specifically provides you with a standalone right to have your needs assessed as a carer or a parent of a disabled child. If you are a carer of a child who's turning 18, then there are provisions that now allow for what will happen during the transition period. So we don't get this situation that we've had in the past where one thing stops and another one starts. There is provision for a child's needs assessment, so a CNA under the Care Act 2014. And you can apply for this to be done. I think, where is it? At any time, I think, before they turn 18. When you foresee that there is going to be a need for provision once they turn 18, once they become 18. So at any time before, and when it is suitable and appropriate, I think the wording actually is, when it would be of significant benefit to the young person in their preparation for adulthood. So that will vary with different individuals. You may have people with young people with very excellent skills, if you like, but the need to plan ahead and to be sure of what's going to happen, or to explore those possibilities when they're quite, a bit younger, 14 or 15. There's no reason why they can't then start exploring those provisions for their future. It's now in the Act, and you can do that. It also makes provision in the Care Act that if the local authority has not carried out a child's needs assessment, they must continue to provide community care services to the young adult until either a decision has been made that they do not qualify for services under the Care Act, or the care that they've been assessed as needing is actually in place. So you should never be left in a situation where one care provision has ended and another one has not begun, and you're left in this bit in the middle. That should not happen in the future. So I hope that has set out to you clearly as possible where you need to go to look for the provisions that apply to you in your particular circumstances. Just to recap, if you have an adult who is looking for care and support, then you need to go to the Care Act 2014. If you have a child, you need to go to the Children and Families Act 2014. If you're looking for an assessment for your care needs as the parent of a disabled child, then you need to go to the the Care Act. If you're in Wales, you need to go to the Social Services and Wellbeing Act, Wales Act 2014. I hope that's helpful. I will come back and do another video in relation to what happens in Wales, but thank you for listening. And as I say, if you have any questions, any queries at all, please do send me a message through the DSPCA Diamond Support for Parents, Carers and Advocates website. Goodbye.